Patience is running thin in Zimbabwe as the country waits to learn who will be the next president. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Frustration over delays in reporting presidential election results in Zimbabwe leads to violence in the capital, Harare. Hundreds of supporters from the opposition Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC alliance, say their candidate, Nelson Chamisa, has won and have been protesting in the streets and setting fires. Police used water cannon and tear gas in an effort to disperse the crowds and then opened fire, reportedly killing and wounding a number of protesters. President Emmerson Mnangagwa is calling for patience and calm, but European Union election monitors are questioning why it's taking so long to release the results. Unofficial results show Mnangagwa's ruling ZANU-PF party winning a majority of seats in parliament. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has until Saturday to announce if either Mnangagwa or Chamisa have 50% of the vote or will face a runoff election in September. There is much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Chipo Dendere is a visiting assistant professor of political science at Amherst College and researches African politics. From London, Lloyd Msipa is the founder of the Africa Public Policy Research Institute, an independent think tank. Also from London, Joseph Ochieno is a writer and commentator on African affairs. And Dorina Bekoe is an associate professor of conflict prevention, mitigation and resolution at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Chipo, let me start with you. It looks like the ruling ZANU-PF party in Zimbabwe is heading for a major victory in the parliamentary elections. It certainly has the most number of votes right now, but the opposition MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, says the vote was rigged. But looking at the results right now, does anything surprise you?
I think the results are a little bit more interesting than what we expected. There has been a huge turnout, especially among young voters all over the country. So there was some perception that the MDC might do better. But as some of your viewers might know, the MDC has also recently split. So in places where the MDC would have normally done well in Matabeleland, their votes have been split. And when we add the multiple MDC faction results, we actually find that there are more than ZANU-PF. So ZANU-PF has sort of struck some luck in those areas. But there were some irregularities that opposition parties, not just the MDC, raised before the election to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission that the commission did not respond to very well. So on election day, you had some citizens turned away because of confusion on where people are supposed to be voting. I've also heard that there are some V11 forms. So V11 forms are the forms on which polling agents are supposed to fill out election results, that some of those might be missing. During a press conference last night with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, the commissioners were asked about missing forms from Victoria Falls. The journalists said that they had evidence that these forms had been burned, but the commission said they didn't know anything about these missing forms. And so those types of irregularities and other pre-election situation imbalances in media representation, the use of state media resources by the ruling party have caused the Movement for Democratic Change, the opposition, to be a little bit more concerned about the results than they would otherwise be had some of those issues been handled before the election.
Right, the European Union's monitors have been talking about that as well, what has happened before the election. Dorina, we're looking at the results so far, and final results are only expected to be announced at least by Saturday. They have until Saturday to do that. But what do you make of what we know so far?
Well, as Chipo said, I think that the opposition's splitting has perhaps benefited ZANU-PF, at least on the parliamentary stage. But, you know, we don't know the extent to what some of these irregularities have impacted the vote. We're actually still yet to find out what those precise irregularities are. There is a sort of lack of transparency that I think is fueling some of this unrest that we're now seeing with the Electoral Commission not kind of being as forthcoming, I think, as it can be with how it's arriving at or how it's proceeding. And that is sort of an information vacuum that is really being filled by a lot of this unrest.
And I guess, Dorina, it's important that the election results be announced sooner rather than later, given the unrest we're seeing right now.
Yes, I think that the longer there's a delay, the more people are going to become very impatient. And you know, until we see some announcement from either of the candidates to really, you know, quell or calm their supporters, that this unrest will continue.
Right. Lloyd, if we look at Zimbabwe right now, it's a country that's facing enormous economic problems. The economic growth rate is very low. Unemployment is very high. We have figures varying from 11% all the way up to 95%. One would imagine that this would be fertile ground for the opposition to take away votes from the ruling party, but we're not seeing that. What's the attraction of ZANU-PF?
As the other speaker said, one of the fundamental mistakes that the opposition made was to take the ruling party for granted, because they assumed that since the power transfer last year in November, this would be an easy pick for them. And it's quite clear with the way Chamisa was addressing the crowds, because he thought Emmerson Mnangagwa would be a simple walkover. What they forgot to factor in was that ZANU-PF, as a political party, is grounded in liberation war politics. And that means it draws most of its support from the rural areas. And you'll find that in this particular election, they ignored the urban areas and focused their attention on the rural areas. If you look at South Africa, for instance, when Malema addresses a rally, he gets about 60,000 people attending that rally. But the return on the vote is less than 10%. When the ANC does the same thing, they probably get about 20,000 people, and the return on them on the vote is 60%. What that tells you is that rallies do not win elections, but interaction with the grassroots. And that's what ZANU-PF does. ZANU-PF goes into the ground, speaks to the people, the villager, the headmen, and those are the people that carry the word. And that is why we are getting this, this result. This is reminiscent of 1980, where the freedoms that people had completely forgotten under Mugabe were introduced by Emmerson Mnangagwa since November last year. And for them, that was a big thing. So we can fluff around about rigging and everything, but let's not forget that the people in the urban areas live by completely different rules from the people in the rural areas.
And of course, Malema that you referred to there is Julius Malema, who is the leader of the economic freedom fighters in South Africa. Joseph, from what you've heard so far, from what we see so far, has ZANU-PF played this election very well?
Very much so, and in fact, I probably concur with all the rest of the other guests on each and every point they have actually made. But I think much more significantly is that MDC was probably slightly much more complacent than anybody would have thought. I think they underestimated, yes, Mr. Mnangagwa. My only concern, though, is that the leader of the main MDC, that is Mr. Chamisa, suggesting as way back as 2-3 days ago that unless they won, unless they got a victory results, then the election would have been rigged. I think it was perhaps in a bad spirit. If you consider the context within which the election process did take place from the beginning of the coming in of Mnangagwa and confirming that elections was due about now, it is very clear that by and large the ground was generally very fair. But of course the ZANU-PF started from a very, very clear point of advantage. But maybe the opposition necessarily took them for granted. And the MDC alliance candidate had really a huge amount of advantage. One, because he's young. Two, because he's generally quite charismatic. And three, he could easily have made a bit of a score on ZANU-PF, but he did not really do so. Now, when you think about the wide issues that would concern most people in Zimbabwe, I'm really not quite sure anything else that was addressed other than unemployment and economy. And really, ZANU-PF guys are quite right to simply say that, look, we had these issues partly because of Mugabe, but we had these issues really by and large because we're under war with the West. And people forget that MDC was substantially tainted by the perceived relationship with the West, meaning the guys who basically necessarily contributed in part to the economic challenges that the country necessarily faces today. I'm not quite sure whether people are really going deep into those kind of issues yet.
Chipo, you mentioned a moment ago turnout during this election. There's something like 5 million Zimbabweans who are registered to vote, and we had 70% of the eligible voters turn out to cast their ballots. Now, that's a very enviable figure for any country in the world, for any democracy where you have these kinds of elections. What do you make of the turnout?
I think the turnout was incredible, but I do want to address what seems, you know, I don't want to give the impression that I think the MDC did everything wrong. I think it's quite difficult for an opposition party with very few resources to compete against an establishment that has access to state resources. Somebody mentioned traditional leaders. We already know that in some places, traditional leaders were telling people that they must vote a certain way. I've been doing interviews with people that live in rural areas, and they've told me that, look, we know what we're supposed to be voting for the economy, but I live in a place where there are 50 people. If there is a single vote missing from ZANU-PF, this is what's going to happen. So you haven't seen the kind of overt violence that people might expect in African elections. But if people are also going to be honest and truthful, they'll remember that in 2008, prior to the election, we didn't see overt violence. What we did see was violence after the election. And so these are things that people should really consider, whether or not the campaign environment was free and fair. People are talking about the lack of substance from Nelson Chamisa, which might be a fair critique of Nelson Chamisa. But what we also know that is ZANU-PF wasn't offering any sound policies. Rural areas, they are suffering from the poor economy just as voters in urban areas. Did we see ZANU-PF offering sound policies to rural voters? Not really. Have we seen any changes in the economy since the November transition? Not really. So these are all things that I think we need to put into context as we talk about a free and fair election, as we talk about people's ability to turn out. But even with all of that, we've had this massive turnout in urban areas. We've had an incredible number of first-time voters turning out to vote.
Lloyd, I know you want to say something. Go ahead.
All right, yes. I was going to speak about what Chipo's just said with regards to traditional leaders. She should be aware that actually a legal instrument is now in place, making it illegal for traditional chiefs to support any political party. But what has been happening, which we are all mindful of, is that since November last year, Emmerson Mnangagwa has championed a lot of policies that have been quite relevant to the rural population. The command agriculture policy, for instance, that has given the rural voter, you know, a new lease of life. He's refurbished the cattle, for them to start looking after more cattle. He's been supplying them with inputs for the agriculture. So those are the empirical issues that matter to the traditional rural person. Whilst if you look at the urban areas, Chamisa comes in with, you know, high-sounding promises like, you know, bullet trains and things like that. While that might appeal to the urban voter, it is not something that the rural voter will be interested in. And let's not forget the fact that the MDC alliance is a loose coalition of friends of 7 political parties. They have no membership base. So for anybody to expect a political party that has no membership to win an election is you know, it's asking for the impossible.
Dorina, what do you make of that? Our priority is very different in Zimbabwe for those who live in rural areas and those who live in the cities.
I think that they would be different. So I think that Chipo was trying to say that, and that makes sense to me. I think they have different priorities. And they also have different narratives with, you know, what they might envision in terms of, you know, political party. And traditionally, you know, the MDC has kind of catered to that. And I think that's a long-running critique of the MDC, that it didn't appeal enough to the rural base. Or even cultivate, you know, a rural base. But at the same time, you know, it's also a numbers game.
Right.
Yeah.